One woman with a disability, one arrogant millionaire, and one grand piano that would change everything. What started as a cruel attempt to humiliate her in front of Boston's elite turned into a moment that silenced an entire ballroom and shattered the ego of a man who thought he was untouchable. You won't believe how she turned public mockery into the most powerful performance of her life. It was a crisp Saturday evening in late October, and the Boston Grand Hotel was alive with the kind of elegance that only money could buy. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow across the marble floors of the Imperial Ballroom, where hundreds of guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos mingled beneath soaring ceilings adorned with intricate molding. The air was thick with the scent of imported roses and expensive perfume, punctuated by the gentle clinking of champagne flutes and the murmur of refined conversation. This was the annual Beacon Hill Charity Gala, one of the most prestigious fundraising events in New England, where Boston's wealthiest gathered to write checks, network, and be seen. The irony of the evening's cause was lost on no one who truly paid attention. Tonight's gala was raising funds for the Massachusetts Foundation for Persons with Disabilities, an organization dedicated to providing resources, education, and opportunities for those living with physical challenges. Tables were adorned with elegant centerpieces and programs detailing the foundation's work. Speeches had been given, emotional testimonials shared, and donation pledges were climbing into the hundreds of thousands. Yet, despite the noble cause, the atmosphere remained what it always was at these events, a carefully choreographed display of wealth and status, where doing good was secondary to being seen doing good. Emma Walker moved quietly through the crowd, carrying a tray of champagne glasses with practiced efficiency. At 28 years old, she had the kind of understated beauty that people often overlooked in rooms like this. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore the standard black vest and slacks uniform of the event staff. But it was her eyes that told a deeper story. Or rather, her eye. Emma's left eye was a warm hazel that sparkled with intelligence and hidden depths. Her right eye, however, was covered by a flesh-toned medical patch that she'd worn for 20 years, ever since the accident that had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Most guests barely glanced at her as she refilled their glasses or cleared their plates. To them, she was invisible, just another face in the small army of staff that made evenings like this possible. Emma had grown accustomed to being unseen. In some ways, she preferred it. It allowed her to observe without being observed, to move through these glittering spaces without the weight of judgment or pity that often came when people noticed her disability. She had learned long ago that the patch drew one of two reactions: uncomfortable stares or overly sympathetic comments, and she had little patience for either. But tonight was different, in one crucial way. As Emma navigated between tables delivering plates of herb-crusted salmon and wild mushroom risotto, her gaze kept drifting toward the stage at the far end of the ballroom. There, bathed in a pool of soft spotlight, sat the most magnificent instrument she had ever seen outside of a concert hall. It was a Steinway Model D concert grand piano, 9 feet of polished ebony that gleamed like liquid midnight. The lid was propped open at full stick, revealing the golden strings within. It sat there like a sleeping giant, powerful and patient, waiting for the right hands to wake it. Emma's heart ached just looking at it. She hadn't touched a piano like that in years, couldn't afford to. Her own upright at home was a battered second-hand model with sticky keys and questionable tuning, but it was hers, and she loved it fiercely. But this instrument, this Steinway, represented everything she had once dreamed of, and everything that had slipped through her fingers. She forced herself to look away to focus on her work, but the pull was magnetic. The piano seemed to whisper to her across the crowded room, calling to something deep in her soul that had never quite gone silent. Emma had grown up in a small coastal town in Maine called Pemaquid Harbor, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved to the rhythm of the tides. Her father, Robert Walker, had run a small automotive repair shop on Main Street, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his heart as big as the Atlantic that crashed against the rocky shore just a mile from their modest home. Her mother, Caroline, taught third grade at the local elementary school, bringing home stories of her students along with armfuls of papers to grade each evening. They weren't wealthy, but they were happy, and their small yellow house was always filled with music. Caroline had learned piano as a girl and kept an old upright in their living room, its wood scarred and its ivory keys yellowed with age. She played for pleasure, not skill filling their home with simple melodies and show tunes. Emma had been drawn to the instrument from the time she could walk, climbing onto the bench beside her mother, tiny fingers reaching for the keys. By the time she was 4, it was clear that Emma had a gift that transcended her mother's casual talent. She didn't just play the notes. She felt them, understood them, made them sing in ways that seemed impossible for someone so young. Her parents scraped together enough money for proper lessons, driving Emma 30 miles each way to study with Mrs. Kowalski, a retired concert pianist who lived in a grand old Victorian house overlooking Casco Bay. Mrs. Kowalski recognized Emma's talent immediately and took her on as a student, charging far less than her usual rate, because, as she told Caroline and Robert, true musical genius was rare and deserved to be nurtured regardless of economic circumstances. By age 6, Emma was playing Chopin. By 7, she was tackling Rachmaninoff. Local papers called her a prodigy, and there was quiet talk of Juilliard, of a future that sparkled with promise and possibility. And then came the accident. Emma was 8 years old, sitting in the back seat of her mother's sedan on a rainy November afternoon. They were returning from a piano lesson. Emma's small hands still tingling from an hour of scales and arpeggios, her mind full of the new piece Mrs. Kowalski had assigned her. The rain was coming down hard, turning the rural road into a slick ribbon of danger. Her mother was a careful driver, but the truck that ran the stop sign wasn't being driven carefully at all. Emma remembered the screech of brakes her mother's scream, and then the sickening crunch of metal on metal as the truck's front end collided with the passenger side of their car at full speed. Emma woke up 3 days later in a hospital room, her head wrapped in bandages, her body aching in ways she'd never experienced. Her mother sat beside her bed, eyes red from crying, holding Emma's small hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. The doctors explained that Emma had suffered severe head trauma. There had been bleeding, swelling, dangerous pressure that required immediate surgery. They had saved her life, but they couldn't save everything. The damage to her right eye and the surrounding orbital bone was too extensive. The eye was beyond repair. Emma would be blind on her right side for the rest of her life. But that wasn't all. Her right hand, her dominant hand, had been crushed in the impact. Multiple fractures to the fingers, damage to tendons and nerves. The surgeons had done their best piecing her hand back together with pins and screws and months of painful physical therapy. They told her she was lucky to have any function at all. She would regain most of her mobility, but it would never be the same. The fine motor control, the precision required for advanced piano performance, would be compromised. Perhaps forever. Emma spent her 9th birthday in a rehabilitation center, learning to write left-handed learning to navigate a world where depth perception was suddenly unreliable, where stairs became treacherous, and catching a ball was an exercise in frustration. But the hardest part, the part that broke something deep inside her, was returning to the piano. Her mother had set it up at home, thinking it would be therapeutic, a source of comfort. Instead, it became a source of grief. Emma's hands no longer worked the way they once had. Her right hand was stiff, the fingers slow to respond, unable to execute the rapid passages and delicate trills that had once been second nature. And with only her left eye, she struggled to see the keys properly. Everything was flatter, closer than it appeared, her brain unable to triangulate distance the way it once had. She would reach for a key and miss by half an inch. Her timing was off. Her coordination shattered. The music that had once poured out of her effortlessly now came in halting, frustrated fragments. She quit lessons with Mrs. Kowalski. How could she face the woman who had called her a genius when she could barely play a simple scale? She stopped performing at school recitals and church services. The piano became a painful reminder of everything she had lost, everything she would never be again. Her parents watched helplessly as their bright musical daughter retreated into herself, the light in her remaining eye dimming with each passing month. But Carolyn Walker was not the type of mother to give up on her daughter. She had been in the car that day too, had walked away with minor injuries, while Emma's life was forever altered, and the guilt of that inequity drove her to fight for Emma's recovery with the fierce determination of a woman who would not accept defeat. She found new doctors, new therapists, specialists who worked with musicians recovering from injuries. She sat with Emma at the piano for hours, encouraging her, celebrating tiny victories, refusing to let her daughter's gift die simply because it had been wounded. Slowly, painfully, Emma began to adapt. She learned to compensate for her limited vision by memorizing the keyboard, by feeling the distance between keys rather than seeing it. She developed a mental map of the piano so detailed that she could play with her eyes closed if necessary. And her right hand, though never fully recovered, grew stronger with relentless practice. She learned to redistribute the musical load, letting her left hand carry more of the melody while her right handled simpler accompaniment. She developed an unorthodox technique, but it was hers, and gradually, incredibly, she began to play again. Not like before. Never like before. But she played. And in that playing, she found a different kind of beauty. Her music became less about technical perfection and more about emotional truth. Every note carried the weight of her struggle, her pain, her refusal to surrender. Mrs. Kowalski, when Emma finally returned to her for lessons at age 12, wept openly during that first session. The prodigy was gone, she admitted, but something else had emerged, something deeper and more profound than mere talent. Emma had become an artist. By the time Emma graduated high school, she had rebuilt herself into a capable pianist. Not the virtuoso she might have been, but good enough to dream again. She applied to Berklee College of Music in Boston, one of the finest contemporary music schools in the world. Against the odds, she was accepted. The letter arrived on a cold March morning, and Emma and her mother held each other and cried tears of joy and relief and vindication. Emma was going to study music. She was going to make something of her gift after all. But dreams, Emma learned, required more than talent and acceptance letters. They required money. Lots of it. Berklee's tuition was staggering, far beyond what her family could afford. She applied for every scholarship and grant she could find, writing essay after essay about her journey, her disability, her determination. Some came through, but not enough. Not nearly enough. She would need to cover room and board, books, living expenses. Her father's repair shop was barely breaking even. Her mother's teaching salary was modest. There was simply no way. Emma deferred her acceptance planning to work for a year and save money. But then her mother got sick. What started as persistent fatigue and occasional fevers turned out to be an aggressive autoimmune disorder that left Caroline unable to work and facing mounting medical bills. Robert's shop couldn't carry the financial burden alone. Emma made the only choice she could. She moved to Boston anyway, not to attend Berkeley, but to find work. Better-paying jobs than Pemaquid Harbor could offer. She got a job waitressing at a downtown restaurant, then picked up part-time work as an event staff member at hotels and conference centers. The money she earned went home to Maine, helping to cover her mother's treatments, keeping her family afloat. Years passed. Her mother's health stabilized, but never fully recovered. Emma's acceptance to Berkeley expired. Life became about survival, rather than dreams about making rent and sending money home, and trying not to think too much about what might have been. She kept playing, of course. She could no more stop playing piano than she could stop breathing. But it was private now, personal, something she did in her tiny studio apartment at odd hours when the neighbors wouldn't complain. The piano was her refuge, her therapy, her one remaining connection to the girl she used to be. And so on this October evening, Emma found herself working yet another high society event, serving champagne to people who spent more on a single gown than she earned in 3 months, moving invisibly through a world where she didn't belong, trying not to stare at the magnificent Steinway that represented everything her life was not. She told herself it was fine. She told herself she was content. But the ache in her chest when she looked at that piano told a different truth. As the evening progressed and the dinner service concluded, the crowd's energy shifted toward the evening's entertainment. The MC, a polished television personality in a sharp navy suit, took to the stage to thank the generous donors and announce the evening's pledge totals. The numbers were impressive, well over $500,000 raised for the foundation. Applause rippled through the ballroom, self-congratulatory and enthusiastic. The MC gestured toward the Steinway behind him and mentioned that it had been donated for the evening by a prominent music store in Boston, and that later in the night there would be a performance by a noted classical pianist who was somewhere in the building. Emma was clearing dessert plates from a table near the back when she heard the voice that would change her evening, her night, and perhaps her entire life. It was a man's voice, loud and carrying, full of the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. The voice belonged to Marcus Sterling, and everyone in Boston society knew exactly who Marcus Sterling was. Marcus was a real estate developer who had made his fortune buying up distressed properties throughout New England and converting them into luxury condominiums and trendy mixed-use developments. He was 52 years old, handsome in the way that money and personal trainers and expensive grooming could make a man handsome, with silver hair swept back from a tanned face and teeth so white they were almost distracting. He wore his wealth like armor, his custom suit probably costing more than Emma's car, his watch a platinum Patek Philippe that caught the light with every gesture. He was known for his sharp business acumen, his aggressive negotiating style, and his even sharper tongue. People either loved Marcus Sterling or hated him, but everyone feared him a little because he had the power and resources to make or break careers, projects, and reputations. Marcus sat at a premium table near the front of the ballroom, surrounded by an entourage of associates and admirers. His date for the evening was a woman 30 years his junior, a model or actress or influencer, Emma couldn't tell which, and didn't particularly care. What she noticed was the way Marcus commanded the space around him, how conversations seemed to orbit his table, how even the MC had made a point of publicly thanking him for his especially generous donation. This was a man accustomed to being the center of attention, and he wore that position with casual entitlement. Emma was approaching the service station to deposit her tray of dirty dishes when Marcus's voice rang out again, this time, in response to the MC's comment about the evening's musical performance. Marcus Sterling was apparently feeling magnanimous, or perhaps just bored, because he stood up and projected his voice across the ballroom with the ease of someone who never doubted that people wanted to hear what he had to say. "You know what would make this evening even more memorable?" Marcus called out, his tone jovial, but with an edge that suggested he was setting up for something. Forget waiting for some stuffed shirt concert pianist to grace us with their presence. Why don't we have an open mic moment? Let's see if anyone here has hidden talents. Come on. Surely among all these accomplished people, someone can play that beautiful instrument up there. Let's make this interesting. There was a ripple of nervous laughter through the crowd. The MC uncertain whether this was a serious suggestion or just Marcus being. Marcus smiled diplomatically and made a joke about not wanting to upstage the professional who was scheduled to perform. But Marcus wasn't finished. He scanned the ballroom with theatrical showmanship, his gaze sweeping across tables, clearly enjoying the attention he was generating. "What about the staff?" Marcus continued, and there was something in his tone now that made Emma's stomach tighten. Surely someone who works in a fancy hotel like this has aspirations beyond carrying plates. Maybe someone took lessons as a kid, dreamed of Carnegie Hall. Come on, don't be shy. Let's see what hidden talents Boston's working class has to offer. His table laughed, and scattered chuckles echoed through other parts of the room. Some guests looked uncomfortable, sensing the condescension in Marcus's words, but unsure whether to call it out or go along with it. The MC tried again to redirect, suggesting they stick to the scheduled program, but Marcus waved him off with benevolent dismissal. "I'm serious," Marcus said, his voice taking on a challenging quality. "I'll tell you what, anyone from the staff who's brave enough to get up there and play something, anything, I'll personally donate an additional $10,000 to tonight's cause. How's that for incentive? Let's put our money where our mouth is about giving opportunities to everyone, regardless of their circumstances." The ballroom went quiet, the kind of quiet that's heavy with awkwardness and anticipation. Staff members near the walls and service stations shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, hoping desperately not to be singled out. Emma felt her pulse quicken. She should leave, she thought. She should slip into the back corridor and disappear into the kitchen until this moment passed. But she didn't move. She stood there frozen, holding her empty tray, her eye fixed on that Steinway that suddenly seemed both impossibly close and terrifyingly far away. And then Marcus's gaze landed on her. Emma saw the moment he noticed her, saw the way his eyes tracked from her face to the patch covering her right eye, saw the slight curl of his lip that might have been a smile, but felt like something crueler. He had found his target. "You there?" Marcus called out, pointing directly at Emma. "Yes, you with the tray. Come here for a second." Every head in the ballroom turned. Emma felt 300 pairs of eyes land on her, felt the weight of their collective attention like physical pressure. Her legs felt unsteady. Her mouth went dry. But years of moving through the world as someone marked as different had taught her not to show weakness, not to give bullies the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She set down her tray, carefully smoothed her vest, and walked toward Marcus's table with her head up and her pace measured, even though everything inside her was screaming to run. As she approached, she could see Marcus's date looking uncomfortable, could see some of his companions exchanging glances that suggested they weren't entirely on board with whatever their boss was doing. But Marcus himself looked delighted, like a cat who'd cornered particularly interesting prey. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone friendly enough on the surface, but Emma could hear the calculated quality beneath it. "Emma?" she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Emma Walker, well, Emma Walker," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone conducting an interview. He'd already decided the outcome of "How long have you been working at this hotel?" "I'm not hotel staff," Emma corrected quietly. "I work for a staffing company. We cover events like this throughout Boston." Marcus nodded, as if this detail was fascinating. "And have you ever played piano, Emma?" The question landed like a punch. Emma felt her jaw tighten. She knew what he was doing. He'd seen her disability made his judgment about what she was capable of, and was setting her up for public humiliation. The kind thing to do would be to say no, to excuse herself, to let him find another target. But something in his smug expression, something in the way he looked at her, like she was a curiosity rather than a person, ignited a spark of anger that Emma had been suppressing for 20 years. "Yes," she said simply. "I have." Marcus's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. "Really? How wonderful." His tone dripped with false enthusiasm. "Well then, what do you say? $10,000 for the foundation if you play us something. Anything at all. I'm sure everyone here would love to hear what you can do." He gestured toward the stage with a flourish, and Emma understood that this was the trap closing. If she refused, she would be confirming his assumption that she was all talk, someone with pretensions, but no substance. If she accepted, she would be playing into whatever humiliation he had planned, performing in front of 300 strangers who would see her as a novelty, at best a joke at worst. But there was a third option, one that Emma hadn't considered until this exact moment. She could accept his challenge and actually show him what she was capable of. She could walk up to that stage, sit down at that magnificent Steinway, and remind everyone in this ballroom, including herself, of who she really was beneath the uniform, and the patch, and the years of deferred dreams. The silence stretched. Emma could feel the crowd waiting, could sense the MC's discomfort, could see Marcus's date tugging gently on his sleeve, murmuring something Emma couldn't hear. Marcus's companions had gone quiet, their earlier laughter fading as they began to sense that maybe, just maybe, their boss had misjudged this particular moment. Emma looked at Marcus Sterling, at his expensive suit, and his even more expensive watch, at the face that had never known real struggle or limitation or the particular pain of having your gift taken from you and then slowly, agonizingly learning to reclaim it. She looked at him, and she made her decision. "All right," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'll play." For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across Marcus's face. Surprise, perhaps, or uncertainty, but it was gone almost instantly, replaced by his signature confidence. "Excellent," he boomed, gesturing grandly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Emma Walker is going to entertain us. Let's give her a round of applause." The applause that followed was scattered and uncomfortable, more obligation than enthusiasm. Emma turned away from Marcus's table and began the long walk toward the stage. It felt longer than it was each step, carrying her further from the safety of anonymity and closer to a moment that would define her in the eyes of everyone present. She was aware of the whispers starting, heard fragments of conversation as she passed. "Is she really going to play with that patch? This is awkward. Marcus is being cruel. Someone should stop this." Emma climbed the 3 steps to the stage, her legs steadier now, adrenaline replacing fear. The MC stepped aside, looking relieved to no longer be managing the situation. Emma approached the Steinway, and up close it was even more magnificent than she'd imagined. The wood was flawless, reflecting the chandelier light like still water. The keys gleamed perfectly aligned, waiting. She pulled out the bench and sat down, adjusting it to her preferred distance. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, and she closed her eye for a moment, shutting out the ballroom, the crowd, Marcus Sterling and his cruelty, everything except the instrument before her and the music inside her. When Emma opened her eye again, something had shifted. The fear was gone. The anger had settled into something colder and more focused. Her hands found the keys, and she began to play. The first notes were soft, almost tentative, the opening bars of a piece that every piano student learns, but few truly master. It was the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, that haunting melancholic meditation that has moved audiences for over 2 centuries. Emma's left hand laid down the rolling triplet accompaniment, steady as a heartbeat, while her right hand, that damaged, reconstructed hand that doctors said would never play properly again, sang out the melody with crystalline clarity. The ballroom had fallen completely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving, standing frozen against the walls, transfixed. Emma played through the first movement, her body swaying slightly with the music, her face a study in concentration, and something deeper, something that looked almost like grief. The piece spoke of longing and loss of beauty touched by sadness, and Emma poured 20 years of pain into every measure. As the first movement concluded, Emma didn't pause. She transitioned seamlessly into the second movement, the allegretto, with its lighter, more hopeful character. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, the muscle memory she had spent decades rebuilding flowing through her hands. She could feel the piano responding to her touch, the Steinway's superior action, allowing for nuances and expressions her old upright could never achieve. And then, instead of moving to Beethoven's famous third movement, Emma did something unexpected. She began to improvise, taking the thematic material from the Moonlight Sonata and weaving it into something new, something contemporary. She incorporated jazz harmonies, blues-inflected runs, complex chord voicings that showed an understanding of music that went far beyond classical training. Her left hand established a syncopated rhythm, while her right hand danced above it, telling a story that was part Beethoven, part Bill Evans, part something entirely her own. This was the technique Emma had developed over years of adaptation, the way she had learned to make her limitations into a unique style. Her adaptive playing, born from injury and rebuilt through determination, had created something that sounded like no other pianist in the room had ever heard. It was classical virtuosity filtered through contemporary sensibility, technical precision, married to raw emotional honesty. The music built layers upon layers, Emma's hands moving across the keyboard with authority and grace. She played passage work that would have been challenging for any pianist, her right hand executing rapid runs that her doctors had declared impossible, her left hand providing harmonic support that anchored the entire structure. Her single eye, that left eye that had learned to see for 2, never looked at the keys. She played from memory and feeling from that deep place where music lives before it becomes sound. The ballroom had ceased to exist for Emma. There was only the piano, the music, and the truth she was telling through every note. She played about loss and recovery, about dreams deferred, but not destroyed, about the strength it takes to rebuild yourself when life shatters you into pieces. She played about her mother's love and her father's sacrifice, about Mrs. Kowalski's patience and her own relentless determination. She played about being seen as less than about moving through the world wearing your damage on the outside, where everyone can judge it, about refusing to let others define what you're capable of. As Emma approached the climax of her improvisation, she allowed herself to glance up for just a moment. What she saw made her heart skip. The crowd wasn't just listening. They were enraptured. Some people were crying openly, tears streaming down faces painted with expensive makeup. Others sat frozen eyes, wide mouths, slightly open in wonder. Even the cynical, wealthy, jaded elite of Boston society had been moved by what they were hearing. And Marcus Sterling, that confident, cruel man who had set this entire situation in motion, looked like he'd been struck. His smug expression had evaporated. He sat rigid in his chair, his face pale, his earlier companions paying him no attention whatsoever as they focused on the stage. His date had her hand over her mouth, tears on her cheeks. At some point during Emma's performance, Marcus had realized his mistake, and the realization appeared to be devastating. Emma brought her improvisation to a close, slowly letting the music settle the tempo, gradually slowing until it returned to something like the contemplative pace of the original Moonlight Sonata. She played the final chords with deliberate gentleness, letting them ring out into the vast space of the ballroom, each note sustaining and fading like the last light of evening. The final chord hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. And then silence. Complete, profound, absolute silence. Emma sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. She hadn't realized until this moment how much emotion she had poured into the performance, how exhausted she felt, how exposed. She had just revealed the deepest parts of herself to a room full of strangers, had turned her soul inside out, and offered it for their judgment. The applause started slowly. One person somewhere in the back began to clap. Then another joined and another, and suddenly the entire ballroom erupted. But this wasn't the polite, obligatory applause that had punctuated the evening's speeches and presentations. This was something else entirely. People were on their feet, standing clapping with fervor that seemed to surprise even themselves. The sound was thunderous, reverberating off the high ceilings and ornate walls. Voices called out from the crowd. Brava. Incredible. Beautiful. Emma stood up slowly, turning to face the audience, and the sight nearly overwhelmed her. 300 people, the wealthy and powerful of Boston, were giving her a standing ovation. Some were still crying. Others were smiling so broadly it looked painful. Even the event staff had abandoned their posts to applaud, and Emma caught the eye of one of her fellow servers, a young woman named Rachel, who was clapping with tears streaming down her face. The MC rushed back to the stage, his earlier discomfort replaced by genuine excitement. He held up his hands, trying to quiet the applause so he could speak, but it took nearly a minute for the crowd to settle enough for him to be heard. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we can all agree that was extraordinary." He turned to Emma. "What's your name again?" "Emma Walker," she said quietly, though the microphone picked it up clearly. "Emma Walker," the MC repeated. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Emma hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about the moment demanded honesty. "I studied as a child," she said. "I had a teacher who believed in me. I was supposed to attend Berklee College of Music, but life had other plans." The MC nodded sympathetically, and before he could ask another question, a voice called out from the crowd. "She's event staff." Someone else added, "She's been serving us all night." The gasps that rippled through the ballroom made it clear that many people were only now registering the disconnect between Emma's uniform and her talent. Marcus Sterling had not stood for the ovation. He remained seated, though he was clapping slowly, mechanically, the motion looking painful. His date was no longer sitting beside him. She had moved to another table, apparently wanting distance from whatever embarrassment was about to unfold. Marcus's associates looked anywhere but at him, suddenly fascinated by their programs, or their phones, or the patterns in the carpet. The MC, sensing the tension, and perhaps wanting to smooth over the uncomfortable circumstances that had led to Emma's performance, made a gracious gesture. He announced that the scheduled classical pianist had actually arrived backstage, but had insisted that Emma's performance could not possibly be followed, and that the remainder of the evening's entertainment would be recorded music so that everyone could continue to celebrate Emma's remarkable gift. People began approaching the stage. Guests who had ignored Emma all evening now wanted to shake her hand to tell her how moved they were to ask questions about her background and training. Emma fielded them as best she could, still somewhat in shock, her emotions churning between exhilaration and exhaustion. And then through the crowd came a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and elegant features, wearing a deep purple gown. She introduced herself as Margaret Chen, the director of the New England Conservatory of Music. Emma's heart skipped. NEC was one of the most prestigious music schools in America, rivaling Juilliard in reputation and excellence. "Miss Walker." Margaret said, her voice quiet but intense. "I've been coming to this gala for 15 years, and I have never witnessed anything like what you just did. Your technique is extraordinary, but more than that, your musicality, your emotional depth, it's beyond rare." She pulled a card from her small evening bag. "I want you to come see me at the conservatory. We need to talk about your future. I don't know your circumstances, but I do know that talent like yours deserves to be developed, not hidden." Emma took the card with shaking hands, unable to form words. Margaret squeezed her arm gently and melted back into the crowd. More people came. More kind words, more business cards from music teachers, piano store owners, even a recording studio manager. Emma collected them all in a daze, her mind unable to fully process what was happening. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The gala was winding down, and Emma needed to return to her duties to help with breakdown and cleanup. But as she descended the stage steps, she found herself face to face with Marcus Sterling. He stood alone, his earlier entourage having abandoned him. His confident posture had crumbled, his shoulders slightly, hunched, his hands clasped in front of him in a gesture that almost looked penitent. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ballroom buzzed with conversation around them, but in their small bubble, there was only heavy silence. Marcus began, then stopped. He seemed to struggle with what to say, his usual eloquence deserting him. "I owe you an apology." Emma said nothing, simply looked at him, with her one good eye waiting. "I was cruel," Marcus continued, his voice low. "I made assumptions. I thought—" He paused, and something that might have been shame crossed his face. "I don't know what I thought. That I was being entertaining, perhaps. That I was, I don't know, giving you an opportunity. But I see now that I was being an ass. A condescending, presumptuous ass. Emma could have accepted the apology gracefully, could have made it easy for him. But 20 years of being underestimated, of being dismissed because of her disability, of moving through the world, carrying her difference like a scarlet letter, made her unwilling to let him off that easily. "You saw my patch," Emma said quietly, "and you made a decision about what I was capable of. You thought you knew my story without asking. You used me to entertain your friends, to show off your generosity while actually displaying your contempt. You didn't see a person. You saw a prop." Marcus flinched, as if she'd struck him. "You're right," he said. "You're absolutely right. For what it's worth, I think you just taught me something I should have learned a long time ago." "What's that?" Emma asked. "That the assumptions we make about people, especially about what they can or cannot do, often say far more about our own limitations than theirs." It was a good answer, Emma had to admit. Perhaps even a sincere one. She nodded slowly. "Your $10,000, she said. "I assume you'll still donate it?" Marcus's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile, but might have been respect. "20,000, he said. "And I'll match whatever the conservatory offers you for tuition if you decide to go." Emma blinked in surprise. That was, she had to admit, an unexpectedly generous response. She studied his face, trying to determine if this was another performance, another way to control the narrative. But what she saw looked like genuine remorse, the uncomfortable realization of a man confronting his own prejudices. "Thank you," Emma said finally. "That's not necessary, but it's appreciated." "It's the least I can do," Marcus replied. He extended his hand. "I hope you'll accept my apology, even though I don't particularly deserve it." Emma shook his hand briefly. "I accept your apology," she said. "But to be clear, I didn't play for you. I didn't play to prove anything to you. I played because I love music, and because that piano was too beautiful not to play." Marcus nodded, and for the first time that evening, his expression held something like humility. "That's evident," he said. It was very evident. He turned and walked away, and Emma watched him go. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly. What she felt was tired and strangely peaceful, as if a weight she'd been carrying for years had finally been set down. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Emma helped with cleanup, though several guests insisted that she shouldn't have to, that she'd done enough. Rachel, her fellow server, hugged her fiercely and kept saying, "Oh my God, Em, I had no idea," over and over. The staffing company supervisor cornered Emma on her way out and awkwardly tried to capitalize on the evening's events, suggesting Emma could be featured in their marketing materials, that her story would be great for business. Emma politely declined. It was nearly midnight by the time Emma finally left the hotel, stepping out into the cool October air. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets mostly empty, the autumn wind carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Emma stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, trying to ground herself after the surreal events of the evening. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw missed calls from her mother, text messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Friend requests on social media from people she'd never met. Apparently someone had filmed part of her performance, and it was already circulating online. Emma scrolled through the messages, feeling disconnected from it all, as if she were reading about someone else's life. But there was one message that caught her attention. It was from a number she didn't know, but the text made it clear who had sent it. "Miss Walker, this is Margaret Chen. I meant what I said tonight. Please call my office Monday morning. We need to get you back where you belong." Then separately. "Your technique with one eye is fascinating. You've created adaptive approaches that could revolutionize how we teach students with visual impairments. You're not just talented, you're innovative. We need you." Emma read the message 3 times, each time feeling something in her chest expand. Not hope, exactly, not yet, but something close to it. A possibility. An open door where there had only been walls. She started walking toward the tea station, her feet aching from hours of standing, her mind churning through everything that had happened. As she walked, she thought about the piano, about how it had felt to play such a magnificent instrument, about the music that had poured out of her after years of being relegated to her shabby upright. She thought about the audience's response, about the tears on people's faces, about the standing ovation that had seemed to go on forever. And she thought about Marcus Sterling's face when he'd apologized, about the recognition in his eyes that he had fundamentally misjudged her, that his cruelty had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. There was satisfaction in that, Emma couldn't deny it. But more than satisfaction, there was vindication. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or reduced to their most visible limitation. When Emma finally made it home to her tiny studio apartment in Alston, she was so exhausted she could barely stand. But before she collapsed into bed, she did one thing. She sat down at her old upright piano, the one with the sticky keys and questionable tuning, and she played. Just for herself, just for the joy of it, she played the Moonlight Sonata again, note for note, as Beethoven had written it, letting the familiar melodies wash over her. As her hands moved across the keys, Emma thought about her journey. 8 years old in a hospital bed, being told her dreams were over. 9 years old, struggling to play a simple scale. 12 years old, fighting her way back to music through sheer determination. 18 years old, receiving an acceptance letter she couldn't afford to accept. 28 years old, serving champagne to people who didn't see her working jobs that paid the bills but fed none of her soul. And tonight, finally impossibly breaking through. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much, and never once suggested that Emma should give up on music. She made a mental note to call her first thing in the morning to tell her everything, to hear her mother's voice crack with emotion, the way it always did when Emma achieved something Caroline had believed in, even when Emma herself had stopped believing. The piece ended, and Emma sat in the silence of her small apartment, her hands resting on the keys. Tomorrow, she would call Margaret Chen. Tomorrow, she would navigate whatever came next. Tomorrow, she would begin to figure out if this really was a turning point, or just a beautiful moment that would fade back into the struggle of daily survival. But tonight, in this moment, Emma allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in years. She allowed herself to hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. Hope that the girl who had been broken at 8 years old had finally, painfully, beautifully become the woman she was always meant to be. Emma pulled out her phone and sent a text to her mother, knowing Caroline would still be awake, probably worrying because Emma hadn't called. The message was simple. Mom, something happened tonight. Something good. I'll call you in the morning. I love you. And I think I might go back to school. 3 dots appeared immediately as her mother typed a response. Emma smiled, imagining Caroline in their small house in Maine, probably sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, waiting for word from her daughter. The response came through. I've been waiting 20 years to hear those words. Tell me everything tomorrow. I'm so proud of you, baby. I always knew. Emma set the phone aside and looked around her modest apartment. The peeling paint, the radiator that clanked all winter, the windows that rattled in strong winds, none of it had changed. But everything felt different. The air felt lighter. The future, which had seemed like an endless repetition of the same struggles, now felt open, full of possibility. She thought about Marcus Sterling and realized she didn't feel anger toward him anymore. If anything, she felt a strange sort of gratitude. Not for his cruelty, but for the challenge he'd presented. Without his mockery, without his public dare, she might never have walked up to that stage. She might have finished the evening gone home and continued living in the safe, small world she'd constructed to protect herself from further disappointment. Instead, she had been forced out of hiding. Her gift, which she had kept private and protected for so long, had been dragged into the light. And instead of the humiliation Marcus had intended, what she had found was recognition, validation, and perhaps most importantly, a reminder to herself of who she really was beneath all the armor she'd built. Emma stood up from the piano and prepared for bed, her body exhausted, but her mind still racing. As she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was about the Steinway, about the feel of those perfect keys under her fingers, about the sound that had filled the ballroom. She had played hundreds of pianos in her life, from the battered upright of her childhood to the school instruments, to the digital keyboards she sometimes practiced on at the music store. But tonight's piano had been something else entirely, a glimpse of what was possible when talent met the right tools. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Margaret Chen was offering. Not just education, but tools. Not just acceptance, but investment in Emma's potential. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Sleep came fitfully filled with dreams of music and stages and crowds of faces she couldn't quite see. But underneath the anxiety dreams was something else. Something that felt like the first notes of a new composition, uncertain, but full of promise. Monday morning came, and Emma called the conservatory. Margaret's assistant answered, and upon hearing Emma's name, immediately transferred her to Margaret's personal line. The director answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. The conversation lasted an hour. Margaret explained that she wanted Emma to audition formally, not because there was any doubt about her abilities, but because conservatory regulations required it. She spoke about scholarship opportunities, about adaptive music programs that Emma could help develop, about the possibility of Emma not just studying, but teaching, sharing her unique techniques with other students who faced visual or physical challenges. "It's not just about your talent," Margaret said at one point in the conversation. "Though your talent is undeniable, it's about what you represent. You've taken limitation and transformed it into innovation. You've created a playing style that's uniquely yours because you had to. That kind of problem-solving, that creativity in the face of obstacle, that's exactly what we want to cultivate here." Emma's audition was scheduled for the following week. In the days leading up to it, she practiced obsessively, her fingers flying across her old upright preparing pieces that would showcase her technical abilities and musical interpretation. But she also practiced the improvisation that had made such an impact at the gala, refining it, developing it into a full composition that she tentatively titled "Moonrise a Nod to the Beethoven piece" that had launched it. The audition went better than Emma could have hoped. The panel of faculty members sat in stunned silence after she finished, and one of them, an elderly professor who had taught at the conservatory for 40 years, told her it was the most remarkable audition he had witnessed in his entire career. 3 days later, Emma received her acceptance letter, along with a full scholarship that covered tuition, room, board, and even a modest stipend for living expenses. Marcus Sterling, true to his word, had contacted the conservatory and established an endowment in Emma's name that would fund her education and support other students with disabilities pursuing music studies. The news spread through Emma's small circle. Her mother cried on the phone for 20 minutes straight. Her father, never much for words, simply said, "I'm proud of you, kiddo." Always have been, but his voice was thick with emotion. Rachel, her fellow event server, insisted on taking Emma out to celebrate, and spent the entire evening telling everyone in the bar that her friend was going to be famous. Mrs. Kowalski, Emma's childhood piano teacher, heard about the gala performance through the local news in Maine and sent a long letter filled with memories and encouragement. She wrote, "I always knew you were special, Emma. Even after the accident, even when you struggled, I could see the music in you. It was never about your eyes or your hands. It was always about your heart. And your heart has always been extraordinary." Emma's final shift with the staffing company was bittersweet. She had spent years in this work, and while she wouldn't miss the long hours or sore feet, she had formed bonds with her colleagues, people who understood the grind of service work and the strange intimacy of moving through other people's celebrations as invisible labor. They threw her a small goodbye party in the break room, and Emma found herself tearing up as she hugged people goodbye, promising to keep in touch. The semester at New England Conservatory began in January, giving Emma time to prepare to move, to adjust to the reality of her new life. The conservatory helped her find housing a small but comfortable apartment within walking distance of campus. Emma packed up her studio in Alston, carefully wrapped her old, upright piano for storage, and moved into her new space with a mix of excitement and terror. Her first day of classes felt surreal. She was 28, older than most of her fellow students, and she worried she wouldn't fit in, that the years away from formal training would have left her too far behind. But those fears dissolved quickly. If anything, her age and experience gave her perspective that her younger classmates lacked. And her technique, her adaptive style that she had once seen as a limitation, drew fascination and respect from both students and faculty. Emma threw herself into her studies with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. She took classes in performance composition, music theory, and pedagogy. She practiced for hours each day, her hands growing stronger, her musicality deepening. And she began teaching, working with a small group of students with visual impairments, sharing the techniques she had developed, watching their confidence grow as they realized that their disabilities did not have to limit their musical expression. The story of the gala performance had taken on a life of its own. The video that someone had filmed went viral, racking up millions of views across various social media platforms. News outlets picked it up, running human interest pieces about the talented pianist who had overcome disability and class barriers to pursue her dreams. Emma did a handful of interviews, uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing that her story might inspire others, might help shift perceptions about what people with disabilities could achieve. Marcus Sterling, to his credit, stayed out of the spotlight regarding the incident. He made no public statements beyond confirming his endowment to the conservatory, and he never tried to position himself as a hero in Emma's story. Through mutual acquaintances, Emma heard that the evening had genuinely affected him, that he had begun donating more substantially to disability advocacy organizations, and had reportedly become less abrasive in his business dealings. She didn't know if that was true, or just wishful thinking on the part of people who wanted to believe in redemption arcs, but she hoped it was true. She hoped that her moment on that stage had changed more than just her own life. Months passed, then a year. Emma completed her first year at the conservatory with honors. She performed in several student recitals, and one major concert, each time feeling a bit more comfortable on stage, a bit more at home in the spotlight that had once terrified her. She continued to develop her adaptive teaching methods, and the conservatory began incorporating some of her techniques into their broader curriculum for all students, recognizing that adaptability and creative problem-solving were valuable skills for any musician. In the spring of her second year, Emma was invited to perform at a benefit concert for the Massachusetts Foundation for Persons with Disabilities, the same organization the gala had been supporting the night everything changed. The event was held at Symphony Hall, and Emma stood backstage before her performance, looking out at the auditorium that held over 2,000 seats. 2 years ago, she had been serving champagne and clearing plates invisible to the people she served. Now she was about to perform as a featured artist, her name in the program, her story in the evening's materials. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the accident that had shattered her childhood dreams, the years of painful adaptation, her mother's unwavering support, Mrs. Kowalski's patient teaching, the financial struggles that had forced her to defer her dreams, the countless events she had worked moving through other people's celebrations, while her own life felt stuck in place. And then that one night, that one moment of courage or anger or desperation, when she had walked up to a piano and reminded the world and herself of who she really was. Emma walked out onto the stage of Symphony Hall to warm applause. The piano waiting for her was fittingly a Steinway Model D, just like the one at the gala. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe and be present. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. She opened with Moonrise, the composition she had developed from her gala improvisation. It had grown and evolved over the past 2 years, becoming a fully realized piece that captured her journey from darkness into light, from limitation into possibility. The audience listened in rapt attention as the music flowed, recognizing moments from that viral video, hearing how Emma had transformed a spontaneous improvisation into something structured and profound. After Moonrise, Emma played a set of classical pieces, including a complete performance of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the piece that had started everything. She played with technical precision and emotional depth, her adaptive technique on full display, her single eye focused not on the keys, but on something internal, some wellspring of music that flowed through her fingers into sound. The performance ended with another standing ovation, this one even more thunderous than the one at the gala. Emma stood and bowed, and as she looked out at the crowd, she saw faces that represented her entire journey. Her mother and father, who had driven down from Maine. Mrs. Kowalski, tears streaming down her face. Margaret Chen beaming with pride. Rachel and several other former co-workers from her event staffing days, fellow students from the conservatory. And there, in the back of the hall, standing alone, was Marcus Sterling. Their eyes met across the distance, and Marcus nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. Emma nodded back. She bore him no ill will. In a strange way, she owed him a debt. Not for his cruelty, but for the catalyst it had provided for forcing her out of the shadows she had been hiding in. Sometimes Emma had learned the universe pushes you toward your destiny in the most unexpected ways, through the most unlikely people. After the concert, Emma was surrounded by well-wishers, people wanting to congratulate her, to tell her how moved they were to ask questions about her techniques and her journey. She fielded them all with grace, though she was exhausted both physically and emotionally. Public performance was still new enough that it drained her, though she was learning to manage the energy it required. As the crowd finally thinned and Emma prepared to leave, Marcus Sterling approached. He looked different than he had at the gala, less polished, somehow more human. The arrogance that had characterized his presence that night was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. "Miss Walker," he said, his voice quiet. "I just wanted to say thank you." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Thank me for what?" "For teaching me something I desperately needed to learn." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot about that night. About my behavior, about my assumptions, about the casual cruelty I displayed. It's forced me to examine a lot of my attitudes, a lot of ways I've moved through the world without considering the impact of my actions or words." Emma nodded slowly. "I'm glad something good came from it for you," she said. "It certainly changed my life." "You deserved better than to be put in that position," Marcus said. "But what you did with it, how you turned that moment of intended humiliation into something transcendent that was all you. I had nothing to do with your triumph. I was just the obstacle you overcame." It was a surprisingly insightful statement. Emma felt her opinion of Marcus Sterling shift slightly. Maybe people really could change. Maybe confronting your worst impulses and their consequences could lead to genuine growth. "I hope you continue playing," Marcus said. "The world needs to hear your music, and I hope," he hesitated, "that someday you might forgive me completely. I know I don't deserve it, but I hope for it anyway." Emma considered this. "I forgave you that night," she said finally, or shortly after. "Holding on to anger would only hurt me, not you. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. What happened that night will always be part of my story. It's part of what shaped who I am now." Marcus nodded, accepting this. That's fair. That's more than fair. He extended his hand. I wish you all the best, Miss Walker. Truly. Emma shook his hand. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. And thank you for the endowment. It's helping a lot of students beyond just me. It's the least I could do. Marcus released her hand and stepped back. And it's Marcus. I think we're past the formalities at this point. He turned and walked away, and Emma watched him go, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. The encounter felt like the final note of a long composition, the resolution of a dissonance that had been hanging unresolved for 2 years. Emma left Symphony Hall that night feeling something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't happiness exactly, though she was happy. It wasn't pride, though she was proud of her performance. It was something deeper and more fundamental. It was a sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be, of having found her way back to the path her life was meant to follow. Years would pass. Emma would complete her studies at the conservatory, graduating with honors, and immediately being offered a position on the faculty. She would continue to perform, building a modest but dedicated following of people who appreciated her unique style and the emotional depth of her interpretations. She would publish academic papers on adaptive music techniques that would change how conservatories taught students with disabilities. She would give masterclasses around the country, inspiring a new generation of musicians who faced physical challenges. But she would always remember that October night at the Boston Grand Hotel, the night a wealthy man's cruelty had inadvertently given her the push she needed to stop hiding. She would remember the feel of that Steinway under her fingers, the weight of 300 pairs of eyes watching her the moment she decided to play, not to prove anything to Marcus Sterling, but to remind herself of who she was. And she would remember the lesson she learned that night, the lesson she would spend the rest of her life teaching to her students and sharing in interviews and embodying in her music that we are not defined by what has been done to us, not limited by what others assume about us, not constrained by the visible marks we carry. We are defined by what we choose to do with our circumstances, by how we respond to challenges, by whether we let fear or courage have the final word. Emma Walker, the girl who lost an eye and nearly lost her dreams, had become Emma Walker, the pianist who turned limitation into innovation, who transformed pain into beauty, who reminded everyone who heard her play that the human spirit is capable of extraordinary resilience and transformation. And it all started with one moment of courage, one walk across a ballroom, one decision to sit down at a piano and play. Sometimes that's all it takes. One moment, one choice, one refusal to let others write your story. Emma had made that choice, and it had changed everything. What about you? What moment are you waiting for? What dream have you deferred? What talent have you hidden? What version of yourself have you been afraid to let the world see? Don't wait for your Marcus Sterling moment for someone to challenge or mock you into action. Take the stage yourself. Sit down at your piano, whatever that piano might be for you, and play. Your moment is now. Your time is now. Don't let fear or doubt or the judgments of others keep you from becoming who you were always meant to be. Emma's story is proof that it's never too late, that circumstances can change, that one courageous decision can alter the entire trajectory of your life. If Emma's story moved you, if it inspired you to think differently about your own challenges and possibilities, please subscribe to this channel. We share stories of ordinary people who found the courage to do extraordinary things, who overcame obstacles that seemed insurmountable, who refused to let their circumstances define their destiny. These are stories about resilience, about transformation, about the incredible capacity of the human spirit to adapt and overcome and thrive. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's struggling with their own challenges, someone who has forgotten how capable and talented and worthy they are. Sometimes all it takes is one story, one example, one reminder that transformation is possible, to give someone the courage to take their own first step. Emma Walker is living proof that your limitations do not define you, that your past does not determine your future, and that one moment of courage can change absolutely everything. The question is, what will your moment be? And more importantly, when it comes, will you be ready to take it?